What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Locked On Badgers. Great show today. John Garcia Jr. joins. We got two potential impact defensive players we're going to talk about in the 24 class, plus some big picture recruiting talk that John Garcia is going to be expertly suited to answer for us. So we're going to talk about all that and more on today's Locked On Badgers. Let's go.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, my friends? Welcome to Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Really do appreciate everybody tuning in. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Herrings. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. And as promised, we got the man. We got John Garcia Jr. joining the show. As always, Locked On's recruiting insider, one of the favorite guests we have every week if we can get him. John, thank you as always, my friend, for jumping on.
Absolutely, Ryan. Happy to be back.
So a couple, we've kind of shifted gears a little bit. We were frenetic there for a while with the transfers and the quarterbacks and Longo and Fickle. So we're looking more 2024 now. A couple impact defensive players that Wisconsin's really been linked to that I want to talk about. Let's start with Kellen Lindstrom, 6'4", 240, 250-pound defensive lineman out of Missouri. What are your thoughts on Lindstrom's game on film when you watch him play?
Oh, man, a lot to like here. Lengthy, strong, runs well, high motor. Love his hands. I think he's a heavy-handed guy who can move some bodies without having to win from the leverage department. But he's got some polish in his game there as well. Really productive, too. I think he's had like 160 tackles over the last 2 years. Not something you see every day from a guy who lines up outside pretty much every single play. So there's a lot to like about where his game is right now from a floor standpoint. Obviously, his frame suggests he could probably add some weight if he needs to, but he looks pretty darn good on the hoof right now. Three-sport guy, track, baseball in there as well. I mean, this is a very interesting recruit from a football and athletic profile standpoint. But, yeah, you could see why he's kind of blown up. I think, in the last few months, he's added like 20 plus scholarship offers. So this has become a true national recruitment, which is, something that happens this time of year, especially at premium positions, like guys who can get after the passer. So Wisconsin's right in the thick of it. Obviously, the next steps are always getting those return trips up to Madison. That's surely important in that regard. And he looks like he's pretty early in the process as well. So I think that's probably good news for the Badgers, but a lot of schools are jumping in. I think Alabama offered him today, like before we recorded this. I mean, so this thing is going national pretty quickly. So this will be another one of those tests, right? Can Wisconsin hang in these battles this early in Luke Fickell's tenure? And I tend to think the answer is yes, but obviously we'll wait and see with this case in particular.
Yeah, you mentioned Bama offering, Tennessee's in there. I think Miami, Auburn, Arkansas, Notre Dame, like you name it, and they're kind of in on this kid right now. But I wanted to kind of come back here. You mentioned 160 tackles over the last 2 years. There's like 40 of them that are just him flying down the line of scrimmage, tracking people down the motor. Talk to me about watching players on film. How are you able to judge motor? Is it just this certain number of plays he tracks down from behind? I mean, are there players you watch a film and you're like, oh, I don't like the motor?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a lot of guys, if the play is not a front side play, or to their side, I should say, you see guys gear down all the time. I think on different position groups, you see kind of different samples of loafing. We used to call it loafing back in my day. I'm feeling old as I say that because these kids probably don't call it that. But yeah, you can tell. I mean, obviously the in-person evaluations are the best way to dig into those things. But conversely, the motor is strong when you're the backside defender making a bunch of tackles. And then we see that throughout Lindstrom's tape. And it also shows, kind of the discipline and efficiency he has. Big guy, big stride, and he really gains ground in a hurry. And he's efficient in his path towards the ball carrier. So, yeah, there's no lack of effort here. And then, you dig a little bit more into the kid and you see multi-sport background, having to get up at 5 a.m. to do this sport and then shift over to the other sport. 24/7 reported that like Grant Whitstrom is his positional coach in high school. You're like college football Hall of Famer. I mean, pretty crazy when you've got a guy who, kind of projected similarly back in the day, college All-American at Nebraska, leading the way for you. And he says that they're similar, at the same stage of their high school careers. Maybe those quotes are the reason why Lindstrom's blown up even more over the last few weeks. But there's just a lot to like here. And everybody around him says that it's the work ethic is like the main thing that stands out. And when you have an ideal athletic frame and profile, and people talk about your work ethic primarily, I mean, I think that's a very good sign. And the tape backs it up. I mean, he is all over the place, making plays in the backfield. And he's kind of violent when he gets there on top of it, which is obviously something you like in the potential turnover department as well. But the motor here is pretty apparent right out of the gates, because technically and leverage wise, I think he's got some room to grow here, but it doesn't stop his ability to try to impact the play. I think that's always a good sign.
Hey, it's funny you mentioned Lindstrom because I was actually about to ask a Nebraska-ish question, more about Missouri recruiting. It felt like in the 80s, 90s, Nebraska kind of owned that block of the country. They could go in Missouri, Iowa. Who owns Missouri now? Who should own Missouri now? Like, you see Alabama coming up for this kid. Obviously, certain schools recruit nationally, but Missouri in general, who's making hay there?
Well, it should be Missouri. It should be Mizzou. It should be the Tigers. I mean, they got Luther Burden to stay home, and I think that was his banner, a win in that state as we've seen. But consistently, a lot of folks have been able to come in there and grab recruits in this era. We've seen Notre Dame do it in the Midwest, like you mentioned, Alabama. We've seen Texas A&M go up and have success in St. Louis, Ohio State, of course, in the Midwest. So I don't think any one school owns it. It's kind of like the state of Texas or the state of Florida, where everybody feels like they've got at least a puncher's chance for a recruit. And in this class, the state is loaded on the defensive line, and a bunch of programs are recruiting, Lindstrom and Williams-Nawarney, a couple other guys in Missouri that are national recruits already. It's February. That's not something we see every single cycle, but we've seen the blow up here for Lindstrom, and it's going to be an all hands on deck kind of deal when the spring evaluation period opens and he hits the road for his next round of visits. But, no disrespect to Eli Drinkwitz and the Tigers, but nobody owns the St. Louis Metro, which the St. Louis Metro in the state of Missouri has kind of been a sleeper. I mean, every year you look up and there's more and more talent from the state. So I do think it's something that is going to become more of a thing as time moves forward. But right now it's kind of a national recruiting, fertile ground to jump into.
And you mentioned stay on the recruiting side of this. Feels like he's kind of in the early stages, as you mentioned. Do you have any type of sense of where maybe he might be leaning or what kind of timetable we might be looking at here?
I think it's a longer timetable. We mentioned multi-sport guy, so he's got a lot of commitments this time of year. So I think it'll pick up once the school year winds down in May or June, depending on the state. I'm not sure in Missouri what that academic calendar looks like, but summer official visits would be right around the corner anyway for a guy like that. And that's really where we're seeing a lot of these schools starting to almost bank visits. It's interesting because when the spring official visits first came about, that was the window everybody wanted, right? Because the northern schools were like, hey, the weather's turning. It's really nice out. Spring practice is going on. You're going to get an iteration of our next team. But now I think because of the portal, that has slowed down because a lot of these teams are like, hold on, we need to evaluate these new guys we got, try to hold on to some other guys, and then look around to the other guys that might be available in the portal. So we're seeing more unofficial visits for spring practice and official visits in the summer when there's nothing going on and you could spend more time with these recruits. So I think relative to that trend that we're starting to see, it's probably good that Lindstrom is in no rush, because right when his schedule clears up a little bit, he's going to be able to hit some summer OVs and start to trim his list. And that's going to be obviously a tall task because he's getting a new offer every day, it feels like.
That's really kind of a fascinating point you brought up with some of the unintended aspects of the portal coming in and the demands on coaches' time. Now, like you said, you got to re-recruit your own guys after the portal, after spring practices, or not, right? Maybe some guys you don't want to re-recruit. So that is an interesting dynamic there at play. All right, coming up, we have another edge defender that we're going to talk about with John. A very different type of edge defender, but we're going to talk about him next on Locked On Badgers. But first, today's show is brought to you by our good friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel is the number one sportsbook in the country. It's what we use. It's the official sportsbook of the Locked On Network. And now's the perfect time to download FanDuel. because we are halfway through the NBA season. The finals, the playoffs are coming up, and you get, if you're a new customer, a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. So there's no risk. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from the money line, points scored, three-pointers made, rebounds, assists, blocks, wherever you want to go, plus single game parlays. Combine all that into a betting sandwich. And it's as simple and easy as you can find on the internet. That's why they're number one. That's why we use them. And I've talked about it a lot. Kevin Durant to Phoenix, plus 500 to win the title on FanDuel. That's where I'm at. Again, I bet with my heart. I don't always bet with my head. I'm a Suns guy, but that's where I'm at. Plus player props, everything and more, exclusive bets, all on FanDuel. So don't miss your chance to get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Thank you so much for tuning in to Locked On Badgers. Get John Garcia back on here as always. Big fan of John Garcia every time we can get him on. John, I want to talk another, and this is one we were talking offline a little bit. There's an interesting pipeline. I don't know how much you can use the word pipeline in today's recruiting world, but
yeah,
Wisconsin has kind of tapped into the Hawaiian powerhouse St. Louis High School. They're after another edge defender there. Obviously, that's where Trech Kekahuna originally was from. Nick Herbig's from there, powerhouse school. And now they're after, I'm going to try this name, Anelu Lafaele. I'm mispronouncing it. You tell me where it is, but edge defender, a lot of burst off the line, 4-star, 3-star type player, really another in-demand guy. Where are we at on his film and his recruitment?
Yeah, Anelu Lafaele is a really interesting modern player. I mean, an edge guy who isn't the size and frame that Lindstrom presents. He's the converse of that. 6'3", 235, 240 or so. Just a flasher, a guy who really jumps off the tape with his energy, his get off. He is that leverage guy and the quickness type of winner off the edge. 2-point stance, 3. We saw a 4-point stance on his tape as well. A lot of get off. The line of scrimmage is where he wins quite literally here. And he's another one where the recruitment is picking up here pretty quickly. And this pipeline is fascinating to look into because Wisconsin has been there forever in his recruitment, dating back to the previous staff. He took a November unofficial visit across the Pacific, across the Pacific time zone into the Midwest, and he saw Madison. He loved it. He called it a vibe. And, the new staff took over and that offer was reaffirmed, and that relationship has continued and been furthered. Obviously, in between, Trech committed, decommitted, and then signed with Wisconsin anyway. And this was obviously a big factor in this potential pipeline here going forward, to the point where there's only 2 official visits on the books right now for Failele. And right now, Wisconsin is the first one. The first weekend of June, we mentioned that spring portal window wraps up mid-May. Boom, turn to the official visits in the month of June and start to pick up commitments. And now he's going to make his return trip to Madison. That's Lafaele, I should say. They're making his return trip to Madison. So you want the first or the last. We've talked about this a lot from an official visit perspective. And I think what's interesting here is you're not selling Madison anymore. He's already been there, done that. He was in town for the Maryland game last year. I believe it was one of the colder games of the season. So he got that game experience and the city experience on that trip, because you're not flying in from Hawaii and staying for just a couple of hours like some of the local recruits can. You're staying multiple days. And then obviously now it's about the staff. You don't need a tour of Madison or Camp Randall, all that stuff. You've done that. You'll still get it. But it's not as important. It's going to be about sitting down with the current coaching staff, reconnecting with Trech and the rest of the roster, and kind of going from there. But like you said, another one who is emerging. Notre Dame's on there. They're getting the second official visit. He's trying to set up more trips. The Pac-12 programs are clamoring for him. He's technically in that footprint. So naturally, a lot of those schools are going to pop up and down his list. You wonder, is this a UCLA, USC kind of deal? Does Oregon get involved at a higher degree? All of those are potentially on the table. But if you look at what he has done this offseason, he said he's 15 pounds bigger. And I saw some camp clips of him over the last few weeks. He still looks really good, really quick. He's not lost that calling card while trying to bulk up and play at, 240 or so. So his stock is, I think, still very much on the way up. So you could look at it one of two ways, Ryan. You could say, hey, the schools that were in before the blow up are going to get the benefit of the doubt. Wisconsin would be one of those schools. Or you say, hey, everybody's an option no matter when they come in. But Wisconsin's already got an official visit set, and it was the first one that was set. I believe the Notre Dame trip just got set. So again, this Wisconsin interest is very tangible. It's being reciprocated both by what he says and certainly by what he's planning to do.
And, one of the things with Lafaele too, you watch the film and you can envision him in space. There's clips of him covering the flat, right? We talked about the flashiness. Like there's plays he just runs around the tackle and bangs the quarterback, but he can get in the flat. He can cover. He feels like a Swiss Army knife type of a versatile defender that you need in today's college game. You need that against Ohio State and Michigan.
100%, right? Can you wall off one of these athletic tight ends or running backs or slot receivers as much as you can come downhill and wreak havoc on the quarterback? And I think with him, that answer is yes. The lateral ability is really strong here, plays very square and well, while he's working downhill towards the football, which maybe can lend into some, underneath zone principles from a coverage standpoint. So I think there's a nice foundation here, an athletic foundation. And look, coming up in Hawaii, these kids play all over the place. There's some offense in there. There's more spatial awareness in his game already than his size and maybe position would otherwise suggest. So I really like this kid. He's one of those that the more you watch him, the more you will inevitably like him. And if he continues to put on good weight and maintain that, I would say truly elite quickness, he's going to be a problem in this day and age, because you can be a modern edge rusher at 245, 250 and wreak havoc. I mean, look at obviously at the top, Will Anderson, those type of players in college football are the hallmarks of the sport defensively. So obviously those are lofty names to compare him to, but you can live in that size and that frame and still do as much damage as, your big physical Myles Garrett, classic JJ Watt style of defensive end or pass rusher.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about the connection there to St. Louis High School in Hawaii. By the way, I always picture like this, people around some restaurants there like, another one went to Wisconsin. I don't know. It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
It is very odd. Talk to me again about, we talked about this a long time ago with Trech, but just how good is that high school and how much talent do they churn out?
It's the power on the entire island. It's football has always been a big deal in Hawaii, and that has only increased over the last, I would say, 15, 20 years or so. You can look anywhere and see so many great examples of Hawaiian influence, and it mostly draws back to that school. Marcus Mariota, Tua Tagovailoa. I mean, the list goes on and on. From St. Louis High School just in this era. But they've kind of always been that school. It's just one of the first ones you think of. I think if you would compare it to a school in the States, it would be a Mater Dei. It would be an IMG. It would be a St. Thomas Aquinas. Shout out to James White, former Badger. I think he retired recently. I think it's one of those banner programs that you just kind of have to look at. And if you're going to put the resources into recruiting Hawaii, it's probably stop number one for every single school looking to recruit the island. And naturally, like we see with all those other schools I just mentioned, when one school is the power, the surrounding schools become the kind of the secondary powers, yet and still St. Louis is able to hold them off from a prospect production standpoint. But that's still sort of ground zero when you go out to recruit some of these Hawaiian athletes.
I love it. And it's cool that the Badgers were able to get into that pipeline. And as you mentioned, he's aware of Nick Herbig. You talking about an edge rusher that's made that journey from that school to Madison and is now getting ready to go to the NFL. That's a selling point. You can very easily point to that as, hey, this could be your path in Madison. Coming up, I do want to pick John's brain. There's some interesting questions I have that I feel like people who follow recruiting always ask themselves or ponder. We're going to get John's perspective on this from a national perspective. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, a quick break for words from our friends of the show. All right, I want to thank everybody for tuning in to Locked On Badgers. Really do appreciate all the support. Everybody, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening, wherever you're finding the show, really, really do appreciate it. We're going to get John back on the show. John, first and foremost, as always, where can people find what you're doing? Where can they follow you?
Yeah, Twitter's the best spot, John Garcia underscore JR if you want to talk ball there. We kind of do it at every level, right? High school, certainly college ball, and we'll definitely dabble in the NFL, especially this time of year, right? Combine, NFL draft season. It's when all of it converges. So it's a fun time of year. So come chop it up with us.
Love it. Let's talk about, I wanted to pick your brain on some bigger picture recruiting questions, but I want to start here and turn it over to you. What are some things recruiting wise that fans say or talk about continually that maybe just isn't really true?
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. I think maybe ranking kids off of the offer list is not as one-to-one as fans may suggest. Oh, well, this kid committed to Minnesota, but he had a Bama scholarship offer. How could he only be a mid 3-star or whatever the complaint is? Look, there's a lot of different ways scholarship offers get extended. Some of them are realer than others, let's say. Some of them are more tangible than others. So it's hard to allow the offer list to dictate a lot of the conversation here, really, because schools have to offer kids early. Unless you're Stanford, really, you've got to get in the offer game pretty early. Even your Georgias of the world have to do that to keep up, because it's now become a game of who got in early, who's shown the love primarily here. So there are schools that will offer a kid prematurely just to kind of hang around in the race. But when push comes to shove and you get closer to official visit season, like we're about to be in, or verbal commitment, or certainly signing day time, those schools are not to be heard from, in the conversation. So I do think that's one of the elements to where you understand optically where the gripes come in, but in reality, Tennessee offering 450 players, doesn't mean that there's 450 blue chip recruits out there in a certain class. I mean, maybe some years the number's that high, but most years it's certainly well under that. So I do think the offer lists are always to be taken with a grain of salt, especially this time of year. We just talked about it with Lindstrom, right? Like, everybody's offering this kid right now, and he's a hot, trendy recruit that the more you look into, the more you like. Well, that's going to create, a little bit of envy, right? So if Alabama just offered, I'm sure Auburn had already jumped in, and some other schools in that kind of atmosphere that makes you take a bit of a closer look. It doesn't mean you're going to pursue them to the same degree per se, but you understand why these kids pick up offers in bunches, and that typically means that you've got varying levels of true interest, and it also changes. That's the other thing. All these schools change their board, I would say, more frequently than the industry changes its board. So, I worked at Sports Illustrated and 24/7 and Scout. You do re-rankings every several months, right? I think you do one early in the new year. You certainly do a spring and a summer ranking adjustment. These college boards are changing by the day, by the evaluation, with these coaches on the road and the tape coming in from Friday nights. So I do think that can also impact the scholarship offer list, and how much, again, schools are actually pushing for some of these recruits. And then conversely, hey, is the Bama bump a real thing? Absolutely. Why wouldn't it be? It's viewed so negatively, like, oh, well, these guys aren't doing their job because they're just watching, who Alabama prioritizes and kind of leaning there. But look, I look at recruiting subjectively, right? Everything's a data point. And if the school and other schools are going to contend this, right? Georgia, Clemson, Ohio State, et cetera. If the school that has been on the best run, especially at certain positions, start to prioritize recruits, how could you not take a second look at how you feel about said recruit? Like, if Brian Hartline is targeting a wide receiver and prioritizing him, and he's a 3-star, I guarantee you every single outlet is going to reevaluate that decision. And they should, because if there's something Hartline, who's paid a lot more money than us to do it, something he sees that we may not, we need to take a second look into that. So yes, there's a Bama bump, but there's also a Texas, Ohio State, Clemson, kind of bump in there to some degree, Georgia as well. That's just a part of the process. And that goes into how a lot of these analysts and outlets get their information, right? Is it in-person evaluation? Is it Friday nights that's most important? What about the athletic profile, upside, the NFL? I mean, everybody has their own sort of formula, and some of them are very numerical and some of them are very not numerical. So everybody kind of does it in their own light. I think the responsibility of the journalists, because they're supposed to be journalists, is to make that part pretty transparent. Like at SI, we were like, hey, we're ranking for the floor and we're ranking for college. Don't care where these guys get drafted. Wish them well. Bryce Young was our first number 1 overall player, by the way. We wish them well, but it's not about that at this time of this ranking on this list. So I think if you're a fan of Wisconsin or whoever in college football and you follow a certain network, just ask. I think that's the other part. Just ask, and they'll probably let you know, hey, this is what we're looking for, or this is why we did what we did. Because you also get the, he committed to my school and moved down 100 spots in the next ranking. It's never that simple, but most of these journalists will answer your questions along the way.
But you realize every fan has every fan base thinks it's that simple, right? You know,
Of
a guy,
yeah, 24/7 hates my school kind of thing. Yeah, of course.
And every team,
and they hate every school. Everybody hates every school.
And every team has 17 recruits that are underranked. Like, when are you going to take a look at this kid again? You know, he's really fast. I wanted to talk to you about this too, and maybe we'll wrap up here because we're running low on time. But you had mentioned, obviously, you have experience across several different brands, and certainly not asking for any industry secrets here or behind the scenes that you can't reveal. But you mentioned how SI is looking at their recruits, right? We're ranking for college potential. Is that pretty accurate across the board? Or, you know, we've certainly heard another recruiting service is looking at who's going to be a future NFL pick. Those are the 5-star guys, the first rounders that we think. It almost looks like they're ranking for NFL upside, essentially.
And you could blend those two, right? Because in theory, if you're a great college player, you're going to be selected earlier in the NFL draft. It's not always that simple. I mean, you know, like a Tim Tebow or Johnny Manziel kind of situation. But usually it's closer than you think. It's not as much of a contrast or an extreme as it may seem. Ranking for the floor versus ranking for the ceiling. Just because we rank for the floor doesn't mean that guys who scream high ceiling aren't going to be ranked highly. I mean, Travis Hunter was our number 1 player 2 years ago. That was as much about the ceiling as it was about the floor. We love what we saw, but man, we love what he could become in the secondary, because we saw a little bit more of him at wide receiver, for example. Now he's with Dion at Colorado, so we'll see. But conversely, you could rank, I should say, for the NFL draft, but that should almost be a reflection of their college careers in their own right. I think within that, you can get into some differences on the intricacies. We value athletic profile versus what we've seen tangibly from a production standpoint. I think you'll get a little bit more variance in that type of argument. But in general, you know, we know the passion is in college football, and the people, I should say, who pay our bills are all fans of college football, and that's the foundation. And I do think that still is the beginning of all of these evaluations.
I love it. As always, John, thank you for jumping on the show, for all the insight. We are always smarter because you're here. He is John Garcia. Go follow him on Twitter. Get lots of great content that way. For everyone else listening, appreciate it. On Wisconsin, we'll keep it going. A bunch more stuff coming up this weekend, next week, especially with spring practice coming down the pike. So on Wisconsin, we'll talk again tomorrow. And as always, John, thank you.
Thank you.